Katie and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be showing you the two different processes I use to grow a Scoby at home using a store-bought bottle of kombucha. So first, let's talk about what a Scoby actually is. In the kombucha brewing community, it's known by many different names. Sometimes it's called the mother, the culture, the pellicle, the mat, the mushroom, the pancake. The Scoby is known by a lot of things, but it is actually an acronym for symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. And just like sourdough bread needs a starter or yogurt needs a starter if you're trying to make them at home, the Scoby is the starter for kombucha. I'm going to show you what they look like. This right here is my Scoby hotel. This is where I keep and store Scobies from former batches so that I'm always ready to brew a new batch. Isn't it lovely? They can look pretty funky, they're kind of slimy. A lot of people think they're really gross and weird, but over the 40 gallons of kombucha that I've brewed, I have grown to love them. So I'm gonna pull one out of my Scoby hotel to give you a closer look. My hands are super clean, it's essential. You always keep super clean hands when you're handling your Scoby so you don't introduce anything new to your brews. So here's a nice, very slimy, slippery Scoby. You'll see it's a nice tan brown. Sometimes they're a lot whiter than this when they're new, and then as they get older, they'll get a little bit darker. Here's a dark one. It's got a lot of yeast hanging around on the bottom. It's also got just some holes in it where carbonation has probably popped holes in it. I'm making a nice mess on my floor right now. But those are some of the different ways that Scobies can look. One common source of confusion when it comes to homebrewing kombucha is what you'll actually need to make your kombucha. Generally, you'll hear you need a Scoby. Well, that's true. However, the symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast really lives and thrives in the liquid. So here, I've got a whole bunch of starter liquid. Scoby lives in this, and as the bacteria and yeast metabolize the sugar in your brew, it's actually going to produce a pellicle just like this. So I often refer to this as a mat, and then this liquid as the starter liquid. You can brew kombucha without a mat. However, you will need starter tea. So this tutorial is going to tell you how to get strong starter tea. As a result, you'll also have a mat. I have generally used both a starter culture and a mat when I homebrew. I feel like it makes things go a little bit quicker, but I have made successful batches with just starter tea. So hopefully that helps clear up some of that confusion. Growing your own Scoby is a time-consuming process. If you're not interested in waiting that long, and I'm talking here 6 weeks, maybe more, maybe less, I recommend acquiring a Scoby in another way. There's many reputable sources online. If you're gonna go this route, I would just make sure that you're finding a company that is selling fresh, never dehydrated, never refrigerated Scobies, and that they're selling them with a good amount of starter liquid. You can also get one from a friend if you know someone like me who has a bunch of Scobies to share. Also, beer home brewing stores will sometimes have Scobies. Lastly, because I know this is somewhat of a contentious topic, I have successfully grown Scobies at home using store-bought bottles of kombucha. All 40 gallons of kombucha that I have made have been brewed using Scobies that I grew, so it is possible. However, sometimes store-bought kombucha bottles are not going to be as strong. They also may have gone through some sort of production processes to make them more shelf stable. So depending upon the brand that you're using, how old the bottle is, you may not have as great of success with this method as you potentially would if you're using a Scoby that you got from another way. So while I've been very successful, I just thought it was important to note this. Not all kombucha homebrewers are big fans of growing your own Scoby with store-bought kombucha. The first process for growing a Scoby at home is super simple. All you're gonna need is a glass jar, 16 ounces or larger. In my case, I'm using a half-gallon mason jar. You're gonna need a bottle of raw, unfiltered, unpasteurized kombucha, such as this one from GT's brand. Last, you're gonna need some sort of breathable cover. In this case, I'm using a coffee filter, but I've often used a paper towel and a rubber band. And all you're gonna do, open up your bottle, pour it into your jar. Make sure you get all those yummy floaties in there, close enough. Now I'm going to cover this with my paper filter and my rubber band, and I'm going to put this somewhere outside of direct sunlight where I can leave it for a few weeks without touching it, right over here. So you want to keep an eye on this jar, but like I said, you don't want to touch it. If you agitate it, you risk the newly formed pellicle mat on top sinking or moving around and then a new layer has to form, which is going to keep you from getting a nice thick Scoby. Once the mat is 1/4 to 1/2 inch thick, you can go ahead and start tasting the liquid. You're going to want this to be super tart. The best starter liquid to use is mouth puckeringly tart, almost lemon juice status. pH range as low as you can handle. The way that I test my kombucha is by using a cup and a straw. So I actually stick my straw into the liquid. You can put it behind the Scobies. Use my finger to pull up a little bit of liquid. Drop that liquid into my cup. You might have to do that a couple times just to get enough. And then I taste it. Mine is not that tart. It still tastes pretty good. So that's not gonna be strong enough for starter tea. You're gonna want to let that sit for some more time. Maybe try it in a couple more days, maybe give it another week. As far as I know, you can never have starter tea that is too strong. The perk of this method is that it is so simple, right? Hardly needed any supplies. All you need is time. One of the downfalls of this method is over the next couple of weeks, this is going to evaporate a little bit. So once it's ready to actually be used as starter tea, you're not gonna have very much, which means your first round of kombucha using this Scoby is not gonna be very big. For many people, that's fine, just a good thing to note. So the second process for making a Scoby at home is a little bit more complicated, but not by much. Essentially, we're gonna be making a small batch of kombucha. So I'm going to make 4 cups of sweet tea. Now that sweet tea has cooled, I'm going to use another 1/2 gallon mason jar, pour it in. Then I'm going to pour this entire 2 cups of bottled kombucha into my 4 cups of sweet tea. It's nice and fizzy. A normal kombucha recipe with 4 cups would only call for 1/2 cup of starter tea. Because I'm using 4 cups here, it should get this batch going pretty well, fairly quickly. I'm gonna cover this and let it sit uninterrupted for a couple of weeks, just like with the other jar. Once a decent sized Scoby has formed on the top, again, I would recommend minimum of 1/4 of an inch. Closer to 1/2 inch would be even better. You can give it a taste, and if it's nice and tart, you're ready to use it for your first batch of kombucha. And unlike with the other method, you'll have a lot of starter tea, so you could maybe even get 2 gallons going. So those are the 2 different processes I've used to successfully grow Scobies at home. I have a few more important points that I'd like to share with you, but first I'm gonna grab a glass. Today I'm gonna sample a batch of my own KaityRoos ginger kombucha. Doesn't look like there's any bubbles. That's always a bummer, but sometimes when you pour it out, you get surprised. KaityRoos ginger, definitely a winner. It's very refreshing. Taste the cherry, the rose is very subtle, as is the ginger, but it's really nice, well-rounded, great bubbles. And even though that bottle didn't have a pop or look carbonated when I first opened it, this glass ended up being pretty good. So I wanted to quickly go over a couple of other potential concerns when it comes to growing your own Scoby. The first being water quality. If you watched my how to make kombucha video, you would have noticed that I mentioned this and actually used distilled water in my own homebrewing process. That's because the water in Santa Barbara, straight from the tap, is very hard. It actually has a little bit of a chlorinated smell and taste to it. And the first 2 times that I tried to grow a Scoby at home using these processes I just showed you, nothing happened. 3, 4, 5 weeks went by and there was no change. So I figured I had done something wrong, but I really think it just came down to the water quality being not great. When I brewed kombucha in Northern California using the tap water, it was just fine, but the tap here just doesn't seem to work for me. So I always use bottled water. If you're having problems with your Scoby growing, water might be an issue. Another big concern of all new homebrewers is mold. Now, kombucha is usually an acidic enough environment that mold is not going to thrive. However, when you're first growing a new Scoby or first starting a new batch, the liquid isn't very acidic, so this is the time mold could potentially happen. Scobies sometimes can look like mold, so my tip is if you're concerned whether or not you have mold is to just let it sit for a few extra days. If it's mold, you'll be able to tell. It's gonna look like the mold that grows on bread. It's gonna be fuzzy and white, or a funky color like blue or green, maybe even black. If it's just a Scoby, after a couple of days, it'll look like a Scoby. Sometimes the brown yeast creates discolorations, but if it's not growing on top, if it's not a weird color or fuzzy looking, it's not gonna be mold. However, when in doubt, toss it out. You can always start again. The last comment I'd like to make is that scobies may move around in the vessel. As I mentioned, if you agitate the vessel, you may see your SCOBY sink. This does occasionally happen, and there's nothing wrong with that. It may mean your SCOBY's not gonna grow as thick, but there's nothing wrong with your SCOBY moving around. The only time I would maybe mess with it is if the carbonation is causing your SCOBY to bubble and raise up. If it's actually high enough to be reaching your cloth cover, it might dry it out. So then I would just use a clean finger to poke it back down so that it lays flat. All right, folks, that's all the 2 different methods I use to grow SCOBY at home using a store-bought bottle of kombucha. Once your SCOBY is fully formed and your starter tea is nice and tart, check out my first video on how to make kombucha at home, as well as my second video on how to flavor your kombucha. Feel free to ask me any questions in the comments below. If you like this video, I'd love it if you could give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Enjoy your kombucha homebrewing journey, and I will see you next time. Cheers.